Hello everybody and welcome to 180 Perspective. My name is Steve. Today I'm going to talk to you about how culture influences our view of God. But let me start out with a scripture. 1 Corinthians 15:33, Paul warns us, do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. I thought that was a good scripture to kind of help us get started. Now let me define what I'm going to be talking about today. Culture. When we talk about culture, what are we talking about? How do we define it? Well, culture can be defined as kind of a certain characteristic that defines a people group within a specific place or time. So let me give you an example. If you've ever watched a nature film and you've watched where these fish are all swimming in the same direction, they change, they shift, and they all look the same too, and they're changing direction. That's kind of what I'm talking about. It's a characteristic that defines a cultural people group. Now, there are certain characteristics of Americans that define Americans. You go to Japan, there are certain characteristics that define Japanese. You go to China, so on and so forth. You go to France, you'll find characteristics that define them as French. Now, within a cultural setting, there are also subcultures. Now, within America, you can find the cowboys or the sports type people. You know, all these different types of subcultures, but still within the larger frame, they're the culture. And so within that culture, there are certain characteristics that impact us, and they determine who we are and what we become, and what we act like, and what we consider to be socially acceptable, moral or otherwise. And so we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Now, let me give you an illustration of how a subculture can infect or affect us. Now, there was a little boy named Johnny. He grew up in a Midwestern town. In 8th grade-ish, everything was normal. He was a normal kid, never really gave too many problems to his parents, was well accepted in school, well liked, did well in school. Well, his dad takes on a job in a big city like Chicago, and so then they move, and so then Johnny is like in a culture shock, because now he's from a small Midwestern town to a large metropolis. It was kind of, whoa, wake up call. Anyway, so then Johnny goes to school, and as he's trying to acclimate into public school, he's having a difficult time because he's not accepted by the popular kids because they thought he was too country-like and too backwoodsy for them. And so they didn't want to accept him, so he felt ostracized. Well, it wasn't long before Johnny started feeling like the only people he could really relate to were the outcasts. And so then they kind of adopt him into their group. And these are the kind of kids that you find out back smoking cigarettes at lunchtime, and always in trouble and rebellious. These are the misfits and the outcast kids. So they take Johnny into their fold. Well, over a period of time, Johnny starts adopting the characteristics that define them. He starts looking like them, he starts acting like them, he starts smoking. And just on a side note, what we find to be true, and you'll find that this is well supported within documentation and research that's been done by psychiatrists and psychologists, they have discovered that quite often when we're introduced to a new social group, there are certain characteristics that we might be appalled at. They're doing things that we're like, no way, we're throwing up the flag, we're saying, I don't want nothing to do with that. But then because of our desire to want to be socially accepted by them, over a period of time, we'll start becoming tolerant. We'll tolerate it. Then, as time goes on, we move from tolerance into acceptance. We accept it, and we're no longer feeling the way we felt about it. And then, from acceptance, we move into participation. And so these are kind of the progressions that can happen to us, and we can see that. Now, that's interesting, and I may come back to this when we talk about how media influences our view of God, because a lot of times that's what happens when we're exposed to media and some of the entertainment media that it takes us down these paths. And then we find ourselves doing the very things that we're subjected to. But anyway, that's a whole other issue, and we'll talk about that in my next video. But what happened with Johnny was that he winds up participating with the things that these kids, he become like them, looking like them, dressing like them, acting like them. His grades plummeted. He become rebellious towards his parents, and then next thing you know, he's arrested for drugs. And all this took place within a year. And what happened? I call it moral conformity for social acceptance. This is when we morally conform to a pattern of a subcultural or a cultural group in order to win their approval and acceptance. I see this happening in church sometimes. I see people come to the church. They don't know the Lord, they have no experience with church, but they see the patterns that people are living, the moral patterns, and so they conform to those so that they can be socially accepted by that group if that's what they want to do. But it's sad because moral conformity doesn't make us right with God. We can, no matter how conformed I get or how much I win your approval or your favor, and you might look at me from a religious or a righteous perspective and say, wow, if anybody's religious or righteous, that guy is. He's a saint. But yet I could be so far removed from God, you could be closer to God than me. See, conforming to win other people's acceptance and approval is not going to do it. And a lot of times we have this view of God that drives us to do that. We think that if we clean ourselves up, God will look on us favorably. I spent years and years in that kind of a mindset. And it was a struggle because I could never win God's favor or approval. But see, it was a cultural mindset, something culturally that was passed on to me. And I'm going to talk more about that in our religion video, how religion influences our view of God. And so we'll get into that. So as you can see from the Johnny story, that Johnny was normal, but then he moved into a new culture that was not acceptance of him, and so then he starts adopting some of the cultural characteristics of the people who he felt would accept him. Now, how does that infect our view of God? Well, what happens is that because the culture lays down the framework, and we start adopting the cultural characteristics, culture, I don't know if you knew this, but culture has a view of God. See, we live in a cultural America where Americans are claiming that, well, at least 70% are claiming to be Christian. But yet they are so immoral that America is the most immoral nation, industrialized nation in the world. There's more teenage pregnancies in America than in any industrialized nation in the world. I mean, that just gives you an idea. And we're supposed to be a Christian nation, but yet we're living immorally. And so then we adopt the morals of the culture we live in, and it influences us. We adopt the view of God from the culture that we find ourselves in, just like Johnny. See, Johnny's culture and changed, and how Johnny viewed God changed. I mean, he was a good boy, went to church. Midwestern town, everybody went to church. He went to church. He gets in this big city. He doesn't fit in, and the kids that he starts hanging out with don't go to church, and they don't want nothing to do with God. And if the God subject comes up, he doesn't exist. God doesn't exist. And so then Johnny starts adopting that too, and it starts infecting his brain. It starts infecting his view, his thoughts, his belief systems, which in turn starts causing what we call genetic expression. Now that's a whole another issue. I'm not a geneticist, I can't go into all the details, but what we think in our mind and the things that we adopt will actually cause expressions genetically. It's called epigenetics, where it comes down and certain characteristics start changing in our DNA functioning. And we could either be healthier or not healthier. Now, of course, you start adding chemicals like drugs and alcohol or cigarette smoking or whatever to that, and it even intensifies the situation. But even without those, just imagine watching a kid who's normal start hanging out with non-normal kids, and over a period of time he starts looking like them. Not just changing his hair and dressing like them, but actually his skin features start changing. His eyes, things start changing. These are called genetic expressions. Just small samples. Proverbs says, do not associate with a man given in anger, or go with a hot-tempered man, or you will learn his ways and find a snare for yourself. I thought that was interesting. Also, Proverbs 13:20 says, he who walks with a wise man will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. So the point to that scripture is that we need to control who it is we hang out with, because who we hang out with is who we will become like. You probably heard that before when you were growing up. Your parents probably said, you hang out with them, you're going to act just like them. And so then you hang out with them, and then pretty soon you start acting just like them. Well, these things, the culture and how it influences who we are, how we see ourselves, and how we view God. Now here's another interesting thing. Some research was done, and we found that culture does not determine whether or not we believe in God. That's genetics. but it can control how we view the God we believe in. Or if we write him off altogether and say that he doesn't exist, just to win approval from our friends and families. So it's interesting, and I'll quote some stuff. I'll put some stuff up probably on the screen so you can see some of the research I've done and some of the quotes. But culture influences how we view God, but it doesn't determine how we whether or not we believe in God. That's interesting, I thought. Now, let me give you a further illustration. They did a study on a couple of what they call zygotic or identical twins. These were twins that were born in Korea. At birth, they were separated. One of the twins was adopted by a wealthy American family. So at infancy, at birth, gone. The other one wound up staying in Korea and wound up being raised by her biological parents in poverty. One was in America wealthy, one was in poverty in Korea. Well, around in their early 30s, they caught up with them and started doing research to see how much of, of the things about them are genetic and how much of it was cultural. And in their research, they found all kinds of interesting things, and I won't go into all the details, but I'll tell you this. When it came to religion, they determined that the girl in Korea, the Korean girl's mom, wanted to be, I guess, some sort of witch doctor. I don't know what they call it in Korea, but she wanted to do something along those lines. She wanted to be like a witch doctor, and she had a religious belief that followed suit with that. That was influential over the young girl who grew up in Korea, and so she had adopted the same kind of religious mindset as her mother. The girl in America, they didn't really say, but there was a major religious difference. She was brought up in a, quote, Christian America, so she had a Christian mindset, a Christian ideology, or a Christian base, even though she probably was just as, morally reflective as the culture around her. So I thought that was interesting. Culture influenced their religion. And that's an example of how culture does influence our religion. It influences how we view God and how we worship the God that we believe in. So anyway, I wanted to share this with you. I hope it kind of helps you. There's a lot more to it, but I wanted to just give you a general overview. Eventually, when my book gets produced and published, you'll be able to read it, and there will be a lot more information there. But this is kind of a general overview of it, and I just wanted to introduce you to it. Again, my name is Steve with 180 Perspective. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to the next time we get together.